Finally, Rick and Vin left Hollywood. In tow, they had Bill Spooner, another Phoenix musician they'd met there. The three of them stopped by the beach house on the way back to Arizona and said they were going to go find a drummer and form a real going group. Rick was tired of making picture frames, and Bill and Vin were tired of being broke and of not playing steadily. When they got to Phoenix, they found Bob McIntosh, a superb drummer and a beautiful human being, and they became the Beans. With manager John Spear, who was the original drummer for Alice Cooper, the Beans moved to San Francisco in 1970 in search of bigger challenges. For a long time, they dropped from sight, just as surely as if they had jumped from the Golden Gate Bridge. I visited them at the stately Beans mansion on Noriega near the Great Highway. The house was a gray, crumbling, old wreck of a place. Vin slept in a hammock in the attic, which he reached by climbing a ladder. More tears for Mom. As the Beans, the four were to become the top rock group in Phoenix, and Phoenix at that time was a center for good rock music. The Beans would join with Roger Steen's group, the Red, White, and Blues Band, to form the bigger Beans group with Roger on guitar, Prairie Prince on drums, Fee Waybill as lead singer, and later with Michael Cotton on synthesizer. All were Phoenix boys.
That was Lynn Cowlitz as the voice of Jackie Dewey, Vince Welnick's mom. Welcome to Missing Man, the Vince Welnick story. I'm Thom Jennings, and I'm your host, and this is episode 2. Well, in the last episode, we talked about Vince and the Beans. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Beans, but before we get into the Beans story in depth, there's a little bit of a tidbit which I think is interesting. Now, when Vince Welnick became the keyboardist of the Grateful Dead, a lot of people didn't understand how a guy from the Tubes could wind up becoming a member of the Grateful Dead. But what people may not realize is that Jerry Garcia and Vince Welnick actually had a history even before he was in the Tubes.
Take a break, and Beans is going to come and play, and then we'll be back later on.
That was the voice of Jerry Garcia. Grateful Dead fans didn't get to hear Jerry speak much after that. That was from a gig with Merle Saunders back on January 20th, 1972, at a venue called the Lion's Share in Southern California. Next up, we're going to hear from Lori Welnick again, talking about the early days of the Tubes.
Used to live with all the Tubes over at on Noriega Street. They had a great big old Victorian, all funky and everything, and they were all on like subsidized food stamps or whatever at the time. They could go down to the farmer's market and buy a whole bunch of vegetables. I think Fee was cooking all the time. Vince and his good friend from Phoenix. It really was a lifelong friend, Michael Carpenter, who was Mick Anger. He changed his name. They lived up in the attic. Everybody else was downstairs. After a while, Vince's sister, Nancy, moved and got a really nice flat on 38th Avenue in Lincoln. And they moved in there, and that's when I met Vince. He had a room full of plants, and a piano was in there. A small little piano that used to belong to, whose piano was that? I think it was Prairie's mom's piano. It was a tiny little piano, tiny little spinet. So he would play the piano every day. Vince practiced every single day. That's why it was difficult for him to go on any kind of a vacation ever. I mean, he had to have at least 4 hours, but he would do much more than that every single day. He was dedicated.
I love listening to Lori talk about Vince. And interestingly enough, as I was doing my editing, I happened to come across this little soundbite from Prairie Prince that I hadn't noticed before until after Lori was talking about the piano. Here's Prairie Prince solving the mystery of where that piano came from.
I loaned him my grandmother's piano when we first moved to San Francisco. I have that now in my living room, and I look at it and think of Vince writing some songs on that piano in the early days. And so when I look at my piano, I think of Vince. It's probably the closest thing that I have as a memory of him.
Many of us have experienced the loss of a friend. And you can hear it in Prairie's voice how much he misses Vince. But I found it really, really comforting to know that he still has that piano as a reminder of their friendship. Maybe someday I'll get a chance to see it. Lori also said something about a memento that she kept of Vince's that really struck me. Here's Lori again.
So he had a piano and a million plants and 2 books by the side of his bed. I have one of them. I still have it on what would be, what is his side of the bed. I have that same book that was there when I met him. The first book was The Lazy Man's Guide to Enlightenment. And the second book was Joe, about a dog.
It's an interesting combination. Which one do you still have?
I have Joe, about the dog. It's a very old hardback book. The Lazy Man's Guide was a little paperback book, but believe me, it was really his Bible because he didn't like to do anything strenuous. He didn't like working hard, lifting, or doing anything really like that. His hands. He didn't want to use his hands for anything but playing the piano.
Lori's been sharing some stories of the early days of the Tubes, so let's get a little history in here. The Tubes wound up recording for 2 major labels during their first run. The first of those 2 labels, A&M Records. There was a gentleman by the name of George Daly, head of A&R for Columbia, and he was trying to get the Tubes a record deal, but unfortunately Columbia didn't think that the Tubes would be a good fit because they were a little bit on the controversial side. You're going to hear a lot more about their stage show from Lori in a little bit. And amazingly enough, there was a guy named Rick Wakeman, who you may recognize from the rock band Yes, who suggested that they pitch him to A&M Records. And sure enough, A&M Records, the home of Chuck Mangione, Styx, the Carpenters, they also had the Tubes. Lori sums up the A&M Records years pretty well. The band had some success. The very first record included the hit, which we all know by the Tubes, at least if you're listening to this, I would hope you're a Tubes fan. That song, White Punks on Dope. And a lot of people thought that White Punks on Dope was autobiographical, but actually it was inspired by the New York Dolls. And of course, we just lost David Johansen recently as I'm recording this. But yes, David Johansen and the New York Dolls came out, and Fee Waybill was making a little bit of a parody of the way he looked as far as the Quaalude character. But the real inspiration for White Punks on Dope was these guys that used to hang around the Tubes that had a lot of money and didn't have a whole heck of a lot to do. They were the kind of hangers-on from the California area. Hopefully that makes sense. Anyhow. One of the other people that the Tubes dealt with earlier in their career was Bill Graham.
Bill Graham put him in the Kezar Stadium gig with Led Zeppelin. That was a Bill Graham thing. But, he didn't, and I don't know that he went ahead and tried to book them with a lot of bands. I just think he just didn't know what to do with them.
The not knowing what to do with the Tubes is a pretty consistent theme if you read anything about the band. And Lori mentions that opening gig for Led Zeppelin. And that's legendary because during the show, in typical Tubes fashion, what they did is they took some bags of flour or some kind of powder and sprayed it all over the stage, pretending that it was cocaine. Much to Bill Graham's chagrin, because he didn't want this to be a show that was anything but family friendly. I guess Led Zeppelin was family friendly back then. Who knew? Anyhow, the drug references caused him to become, apoplectic, I guess is the best word to describe it. And he swore that he would never work with the Tubes again. And he kind of backed down on that promise. And of course, Vince Welnick wound up being with the Grateful Dead, who Bill Graham also worked with. Whatever the case, let's go back to the Tubes. First album came out in 1975, produced by Al Kooper, as I mentioned. They had another album not long afterwards called Young and Rich, a year later. And then an album called Now, which was their third album. And none of the first three records did particularly well. But while the Tubes were out there recording, doing their thing, something really important happened in Vince and Lori's life. They got married. Let's hear about it from Lynn, portraying Vince's mom, Jackie Dewey.
On February 29, 1976, while the Tubes were recording their second album for A&M Records in Hollywood, they all came to San Diego. We had a wedding. Vince had fallen in love with the gorgeous Lorene Gear. They were married aboard the Bahia Bell while it floated about on Mission Bay with all the Tubes, the dancing girls, friends, and assorted relatives in attendance. They took their vows before a kind and patient justice of the peace who seemed to enjoy the whole procedure and the rather unusual cast of characters. A friend captured the ceremony on videotape, and I was later able to see what Vin and Lori looked like as they took their vows. And it is recorded for posterity that the mother of the groom, in an excess of joy and champagne, came tripping down the gangplank of the Bahia Bell, a sprig of gladiolas between her teeth. We held the reception at the beach house, where the bride borrowed my cowboy boots to run on the sand and fly one of those kites that looks like a giant sperm in the sky. It was indeed a grand party.
Vince's mom wrote about the day in a way that really captured the moment. And Lori Welnick still remembers it well. And one of my favorite questions to ask any married couple is about the marriage proposal. So Lori gave me some insight onto that and just some really interesting insight onto what it's like to be married to a musician who's just about to go on the road.
We were in LA, and they were finishing recording on their first A&M record, their first album. And we were at Musso and Frank's. I remember Bruce Dern came in his jogging outfit and sat down at the big counter in front. We were in a booth, and he ordered a giant plate of spaghetti. And I remember him talking about how he needed to up his carbs. And I was looking at him, and Vince goes, well, I want to talk about something else. And I go, oh, okay. And then he said, well, we've been living together for a while now. I think we should get married. What do you think? And I went, oh, because we're going on the road in about 10 days. And he goes, yeah, but, we can do it before then. And I went, oh, and then the road is our honeymoon? And he started laughing.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what happened. So after the last recording on A&M, which about a week later we went to San Diego, and his mother set the whole wedding up for us because we didn't have time. And we got married on the Bahia Bell, a boat in Mission Bay, on the last day of February in leap year. And then we spent the night at the Hotel Del, the Round Hotel in Coronado. And the next morning we went on the road. And we were on the road for almost 3 months, I think. I can't remember what tour it was. It was the first spring tour of 76. And we might have gone to Europe that year as well. So, yeah, there was a lot of touring and a lot of that for the first year or two that we were married. And I realized, well, this isn't, Vince is doing good now. I don't know. I don't trust any of the managers or anything. I don't trust any of it, but it's his choice. So I had to let him go do his thing when he was really young. And I had to trust that he would make right decisions for himself and, that he would be safe with the band. But, I wasn't his mother. I was his wife at that point. And Kenny Ortega was the choreographer at that time for the Tubes, and he was getting offers in Hollywood to do directing and choreography and other things, other projects. And I remember we were there in, it must have been 77 or late in 76. But Kenny was going to work with this new band called the Runaways, and he asked me to come with him down to L.A. And I thought to myself, well, gee, I've only been married a very short time. I mean, Vince is getting more and more popular. Now all the girls who never wanted him before I had him, now they all want him. So I don't know if I should leave town for that long. And Kenny's like, Lori, you have to make a choice. It's your career or what? And I go, my career or my marriage? That's an easy one for me, Kenny. I'm staying home. He goes, well, just come down for a month. And I went, okay, fine. So I went to L.A. and worked with him on the Runaways and Kim Fowley. And I did the, wardrobe design. And during that time, working with the Runaways, Vince was home alone. And he's just sort of, he was always this unruly, teenagery kind of person who was so innocent in a way. He was so gullible. Yeah, he was gullible. And so at any rate, I came home. After we finished with the Runaways. I came home. And I never worked again because I was terrified of what the hell was happening with Vince. And I realized this is such a young part of our marriage. If I don't get this thing right now, it's not going to make it. Because we're not having children like other people who they claim keeps them together. We're not doing that. This is based on love. So it was different. So I come back, and that was a better part. That was the best thing I could have done. Vince was writing more and more music then, and the band was touring more and more and more. And eventually Mingo came along, and all sorts of things. We entered into the 80s. Things started getting sketchy.
Lori definitely had to make some tough choices early on. One of those choices was putting her own career on hold. Now, she mentioned that she worked for Kenny Ortega. And Kenny Ortega didn't only work with the Runaways, he also was the person who designed the Tubes stage show. One of the things that gets said about the Tubes is that they were ahead of their time. But the Tubes stage show really was pretty spectacular. It contained some pretty crazy elements. Kenny Ortega goes on to work with a lot of people, including Michael Jackson. Now, if you ever see that concert film that was about Michael Jackson's last tour that he was planning before he passed away, Kenny's the guy that's designing the stage show. So by the time the Tubes broke up, a lot of other acts were incorporating theatrical elements into those. In fact, I went to go see Taylor Swift not too long ago, and one of the things that I thought about when I saw her, all these set changes and costume changes and everything like that, I'm like, boy, this is kind of like the Tubes without the craziness. But anyhow, I'm going to let Lori describe the Tubes stage show, because this is a great part of our conversation and there's some pretty good stuff in it, so you'll want to keep listening.
Well, in those days, there wasn't anything to compare it with. I mean, they were even doing this before. I mean, I saw Alice Cooper at the Fillmore, but they were just some guys dressed in drag, sort of. You know what I mean? It wasn't there wasn't really a show. They were the show, like Kiss. But the Tubes, they were actually parodizing, the entire everything we grew up with. But I mean, and Prairie and Michael would think of things that were great. It's just that when they were all together, the craziness would occur. Like the Fleshophones, the two guys that used to play the Fleshophones, they had the big vinyl Elvis hairdos, and it was way funny, I mean, the Siamese twins, Mondo Birthmark. And actually, what was horrible about Mondo Birthmark, I forgot where the hell it was. Might have been Bimbos, but they were doing it, and it could have been the Fillmore. I can't remember where it was, but they did Mondo Birthmark, and Fee used to come out with a big hairy birthmark on his face. And some guy came backstage that was, like that.
Oh,
and that was kind of I don't remember that it ever happened again after that.
Wow. Yeah, I guess that's I mean, I remember reading stuff about protesters because of nudity and things like that with picket signs outside of shows and some of the early things like that.
No titties in the Twin Cities.
Yeah, that was the one. Yeah, no titties in the Twin Cities because they dressed up and went in with the protesters, didn't they? Is that what they did?
Well, no. You mean the Tubes did?
Yeah, I thought the no titties for the Twin Cities was a fake. Yeah,
absolutely. And the weirdest thing was at that time. One of the things in the show was Madam, I'm Adam, and it was I mean it's It's kind of about Adam, in the Garden of Eden. And in this garden, everything is larger than life. There's a giant ant, there's a giant dinosaur, everything's larger than life. And so as he's singing along, Madam, I'm Adam, whatever, in the background, the ant and the dinosaur start getting it on. They start... Well, the police went absolutely apoplectic. They just freaking stormed the stage, freaking out. And I go, hey, because I was on stage. Leroy was he was in the show at the time. So I did most of the on-stage costume changes and everything. So I'm up there getting ready to do the costume change, and I see these police officers in uniform, and I'm like, hey, you guys can't be here. He goes, what are you talking about? We can't have things fornicating on stage. And I go, who's fornicating? And he goes, well, those two over there. And I looked at him and I go, are you kidding me? I go, have you ever seen an ant and a dinosaur having sex? I mean, it was just like, what the hell are you talking about? And no, they stopped the show.
Wow.
We got kicked out of Vegas. Now, if you're kicked out of Vegas for porn, well, it wasn't pornographic. But they said it was. And I thought, how absolutely hysterical is this? We're fucking kicked out of Vegas for lewdness? How? There are women walking around with hardly anything on.
Yeah.
We only have girls in airbrushed, their suits were body suits, airbrushed like they were naked, but they were not naked.
Yeah, I remember as a young man seeing that and wondering if they actually were. So now you finally answered that question for me.
Yeah, Perry and Michael airbrushed the flesh uniforms to look like they were naked, but they were not naked. And that was sort of our argument with all of these stupid interruptions, with the show, although it was good for the band. Because something, about that kind of stuff, people want to see more than ever. I mean, as soon as they hear that you've been kicked out, they want to, women marching, the mothers marching with signs, no titties in the Twin Cities. I mean, we died laughing at that one.
In addition to being live show pioneers, the Tubes put out what I think are some really good albums during the A&M years. The live album, What Do You Want From Live? An incredible double live album. A lot of people absolutely love that one. And if you're a Grateful Dead fan and you haven't listened to Vince's work with the Tubes, that's one you should definitely check out. He does some great keyboard work in that, and the band is really on fire. The first album, The Tubes, well, a lot of people say it suffered from poor mixing, poor production, whatever. There's some great songs on it. I go back and listen to that one, and I still love it. That was followed by Young and Rich, then Now. And they closed out their time with A&M, aside from an album of rarities, with a record called Remote Control, produced by Todd Rundgren. And that would begin a relationship with Todd Rundgren that would have its ups and downs. The Remote Control album is one of my personal favorites. Some people say it sounds a little bit too much like Todd Rundgren and Utopia, but I think it sounds like a great Tubes album. You can give it a listen and decide yourself. Whatever the case, the last album for A&M Records turned out to be Remote Control. But still, it ended an era for the Tubes, an important era. But it also presented some new beginnings, because they would eventually land with Capitol Records and achieve some fame. But that fame came at a cost, and Todd Rundgren will be back in the story, featured prominently on the next episode. But we'll close this one out with Lori's recollections of the end of the A&M Records era.
One of the problems was, going back to the management situation, was all the advances that they had usurped. And now there are all this records and all this music that's needs to be given over. And that's an impossibility when you spend 9 or 10 months on the road, or even 11 of the year. You have to stay home for at least 3 months to write a freaking album. And they didn't give them a chance to do that. There was never that. It was always the show. We had the show, we had the tour, we had to work on this, we had to work on that. And that was how it went. It wasn't really much time to work on music for those years. So A&M had put out a couple albums or whatever. It wasn't working. They didn't have a huge fan base, no matter how much they toured, because whoever their manager was at any time, it could have been Ricky Farr, it could have been anybody else, any of them, they all failed. Because in those days, really, television, every single thing you can get them on. Now, Ricky did a few good things in Europe. I mean, he got him on the Old Grey Whistle test and a few other things, but overall, no, they didn't get on David Letterman. They didn't get on Saturday Night Live. None of that stuff. They did do SCTV, which was, one of my favorite skits. That just went to show how far they could have gone.
Well, that brings us to the end of episode 2 of Missing Man, the Vince Welnick story. Thank you very much for listening, and please consider writing a review and or sharing it with anyone you think might enjoy this. I want to give out a special thanks to Lori Welnick. What a great interview I had with her. We're going to be hearing a lot more from her. She mentions SCTV, and we'll be beginning the next episode talking about that famous appearance on SCTV with the Fishin' Musician with John Candy. We'll also be hearing more from Fee Waybill, more from Prairie Prince, and Bobby Strickland will be making his first appearance on the show, along with Todd and Michelle Rundgren. Next episode, we'll be looking at the Capitol years and Vince's time in Todd Rundgren's band. The show is produced and written by me, Thom Jennings, for Coronia Media. And this project is made possible with funds from the statewide Community Regrant Program, a regrant program of the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the Office of the Governor, the New York State Legislature, and administered by my dear friends at Go Art in Genesee County. Thanks so much for listening. My name's Thom Jennings. We'll see you in 2 weeks with episode 3 of Missing Man, the Vince Welnick story.